On now. Cool. All right. So we're looking at the event store and how we can kind of start on a path that allows us to start raising more events and start enabling these downstream teams that want to respond to those events. So folks building out things like CI events, autoflow, Duo workflow, notifications, all the other things. Longer term, we are looking at kind of dedicated technology for this. We've got Dennis Tang is leading the charge, looking at tools like Kafka and Nats and probably other things. But getting to that stage is a very significant lift, especially after I just spoke with Marin about our requirements for dedicated. It's non-trivial. But we don't want to necessarily have to wait that long to start doing some of the groundwork to get people thinking in an event-centric way and starting to build their services in a way that emit and respond to events. So our short-term goal that we're looking at, and I can put something on screen here just to have a crisp thing to talk to, is, we've kind of built out a maturity scale for what the system could look like long-term. And we want to focus just on this minimal tier right now, where that means that we would want to have kind of basic events for our key domain objects. And these are necessarily a little squishy and ill-defined, but think, issues, merge requests, pipelines, and being able to get just the obvious events off of those. They were created, they failed, they were merged, so that we could implement those kind of probably the 80% of what people would want to react to.
Is there is there a parity object that we are defining this against?
I'm sorry,
Like,
what do you mean?
so when we say basic events, in my mind, there might be like a foundational for pipelines, for example. People have notifications that might be a parity object that they're expecting that all things are supported in this new events system, or webhooks. That's a parity object that they would expect all things to be supported in this as a thing. And maybe that becomes viable or competitive, but I just wanted to see, like, how are you delineating basic from basic events for all domain subjects? Like, what is a basic event? What's a key domain object? And how are you mapping an event versus a notification versus a webhook across all these objects?
Yeah, frankly, those aren't defined yet.
Okay.
I'm going to be working with product managers over the coming months to try to get all of those things nailed down.
And that probably was a very hard question for me to ask you, so I'm sorry, but
it's fine. We got to answer it at some point.
But
I am talking with folks like on Import and Integrate. I've been looking through all of their webhook infrastructure. They've got probably a lot of concepts that we could use to jumpstart a lot of these events and schemas. So it's just kind of figuring out, we've got this, 7 different approaches for defining schemas and webhooks and GraphQL and database and everything else. How do we consolidate that into one single thing?
And here's why it's relevant for CI events. So like CI events, there's this presupposition that, like, when we were looking at these workflows, we needed a way to like circumvent some of the fragility of the webhook system. So today customers said, like, okay, we don't like your webhooks because we want to do more robust automation that your webhook support, but it needs to support everything that webhook supports today. So that's kind of like
that makes sense.
That's kind of like a baseline minimal requirement. Everything that is in your webhook functionality for CI events needs to be encapsulated inside of this new event functionality. So to Fabio's first point in the agenda, like, whatever's in this event store system, the CI event system has to be laid on top of it. So webhooks, all the things that webhooks support today needs to be nested on top of that. And then, like, notifications for people who want to trigger events, trigger subsequent automations off of events. Notifications are a part of that system. So they're expecting parity with existing notifications, and they're wanting that synchronous activity to be captured inside of the CI events system. So there's this baseline expectation that in our minimal offering, we contain all the existing GitLab functionality and then build incrementally on top of that. So that's kind of, and Fabio, I don't know, how's your understanding of that?
Yeah, I think it's okay with regard to CI events and what we are supposed to cover with CI events. Um, yeah, I think on that, I don't have anything else to add. I think I'm more currently interested in the definition of new events, like how we want to
Mhm.
start adopting more and more events. Um, yeah, and what is the short-term goal, first of all, and then like what
Yeah.
is the long-term goal? Like why we want to invest in an event platform right now? Is it because of usage data pipeline, or because we
Hmm.
have I understand that like there's also notification in place.
Yep.
So is it because we want to be able to uh, expand the notification, have a framework for notification that we can easily, send notification for multiple things? And is it today done more kind of a ad hoc?
Okay. Um, there were a lot of questions there. I'm going to try to capture as many of them as I can. So first off, like, why are we doing this? Like, tried to capture it in the problems to solve, but essentially a number of teams are trying to do these event-driven features.
Mhm.
And right now they're all implemented in a very point-to-point fashion, like CI events goes and adds code to the issue creation service to trigger its thing. Autoflow does the same thing. Notifications does the same thing. So just in terms of, our own development velocity and our ability to ship innovative features, this kind of platform will help us do that. Um, we also see the benefit of owning this at sort of a platform scale rather than one single individual team, because it allows
Mhm.
us to look at the use cases more broadly and make sure that, the single events we do raise will address the needs of all of these different consumers, right? So rather
Yeah.
than having the lens of like, I need this event for CI events, we want to make sure that it supports dual workflow, autoflow, notifications, all these other
Makes
things.
sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We have had this kind of a lot of this conversation when
Mhm.
we have a team introducing a new event for the event store. We have this kind of conversation like, okay, the event is too specific or it's too
Exactly.
broad, and then we need to
Exactly.
figure out, okay, what is the right sort of abstraction that we need to use for communicating this event. How
Hmm.
does it make sense, in how relevant is this event, for GitLab product, or is it like
Yep.
a too granular, for like a background process? So this is like all good points.
Yeah, and I've actually sent, I haven't checked my messages today. She might have seen this already. I've got a merge request sent your way to iterate on the event store docs to start capturing some of those guidelines for event
Yeah,
definitions.
yeah, thank you. I just approved that, so
Excellent,
to
excellent.
get
So,
merged down.
yeah, we're definitely on the same page there. In terms of reaching parity for example, webhooks, I'm looking at building this thing out more iteratively. I don't think it is going to be built on top of webhooks. I think at some point we will hit parity. And certainly as we get into the competitive and complete maturity stages, we're going to have everything. Um, the nice thing about the way these systems work is that we don't necessarily have to progress through these stages like bit by bit, right? We don't have to complete everything in Minimal before we complete everything in Viable, before everything in competitive. We could realistically start building out events and just add more and more and more and more and more. It's like our first target for our platform is to have these basic events so that we can get folks off the ground. We recognize that it probably won't serve all of the extensive use cases that they had dreamed of and imagined for their features. But by allowing everybody to get started, we allow them to all get started in parallel rather than, everybody being either blocked on,
Mhm.
waiting for the platform to be ready to support their needs or having them go off and build their own thing. So it's like, yeah, the list of events will be limited and, we could potentially expose the downstream capabilities like CI events to customers as, sub-minimal, right? Like this is an early beta, you get to play with it and you can give us your feedback, but it'll allow us to have those conversations ahead of building out the whole system.
Yeah, makes sense.
Let's
Yeah,
see. And
yeah, for example, with regard to webhooks, for example, I would prefer that we would change webhooks to be based on top of domain events, because the webhooks
yes.
would be like a delivery mechanism, like would be like an email notification, a webhook, or but then we have the underlying level is the domain events are emitted. Webhooks could be just like a subscriber of specific
Yes.
events that we will, will react by sending a webhook. But
Yep.
not all events in the platform will have webhooks. Eventually, we could extend it. We can have a way of automatically having webhooks picking up a set of events. But yeah, so it would be more similarly would be with CI events. Like not all events will be CI events, and yeah, but yeah, the domain events, being able to emit domain events is the minimum requirement. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And yeah, the import and integrate team is involved in this. They are interested in being able to port over to this because they have the same problem. Anytime you want to raise a new webhook, you got to go to the service that does the action and tie in your project hooks to it. So, we're probably not going to prioritize existing features, enabling, improvements there. But I think longer term, we're looking at consolidating all of these myriad of features into this system.
Yep.
Okay. Did I answer all of the questions that y'all raised?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So for the first stage, we want to build on the store that you've already built, Fabio. So, it would be based on Sidekick. It would be available to consumers and producers that are within the monolith only. So there are use cases like Duo workflow that this first version just wouldn't support, right? It can't communicate with Ruby jobs from the Python backend. But since it is already in the stack, it would be supported on all of our environments. GitLab.com, dedicated, self-managed. AirGap installations would still work. It's already sales ready because of the way that it's been built. Or if it's not, it's at least in the plan to be sales ready. Somebody's looking at that. But the biggest limitation is just our throughput, right? We've spoken with SREs and they feel comfortable that we could probably 10x the throughput through it. But beyond that, we'd be running it into a world of hurt. So
yeah, and this depends. Like yeah, it depends. What do we want to use Event Store for? For the minimal, phase, I think we're already using. So that's the reason why the Event Store was built that way. Is that we're already using Sidekick. We're already
totally.
Scheduling workers as a side effect of something happening. With the Event Store, you are just refactoring to be more look like more event driven, and we have like a way of defining events and reacting. But underlying is still the same sort of workflow using Sidekick. So from a point of view of scaling, is like whatever we do today is what we are continuing doing with this Event Store. It's more like if we were to introduce some events that would trigger that have a lot of subscribers, for example, that all these events might need to be duplicated across all subscribers and things like that, which we have had some scenarios like this.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. That will not be scalable in the long term.
Right.
So yeah, we also always have to think today about how many events you're publishing, how many subscribers are there, so how many total event total messages you will end up having.
Absolutely.
All the time. So
yeah, and I've got some analysis that I can share with you if you're interested about what kind of scale of events we could expect for all of these domain objects. For the most part, they're all minuscule, right? Like you're getting like sub 0.1 events per second for like issues created, stuff like that. Honestly, the two mammoth ones are Git pushes and job completions. Those two alone are like 80% of the volume if we were to turn those on. So, when we're going back to looking at like what events do we publish in this minimal version, maybe we hold off on those until we have infrastructure that can actually support it.
Yeah. But pushes and job completion webhooks are already handled asynchronously in a Sidekick job. So by refactoring those, we should not make things worse.
That's a good point.
That's saying very with a pinch of salt. We obviously have to think about how we're going to refactor that, but we're still using Sidekick, anyway. So
Yeah.
it's just about changing the workflow a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest risk I see is that, like, as you mentioned, each subscriber is effectively its own queue. And so everybody that subscribes to an event gets that event written into Sidekick. So that is,
Yes.
for M subscribers, you get M jobs for every single event. And so
Yes.
Git pushes could potentially be very popular. A lot of people want to respond to that. If you end up with 10 subscribers, now you have 10 times the event throughput. And so those are the kind of things that we'll need to be very, very careful about in our first rollout.
Yes.
All right. Since we're talking about the rollout, I can share a little bit more about this iteration plan. And specifically, this is kind of the area that I would love your input on, Fabio, to make sure that what we're planning to do will meet your needs. Um, so we're talking about moving forward in 3 phases. Well, one we're talking about mostly today is this phase 1, where we're going to iterate on our existing technology. The focus will mostly be like ensuring that Sidekick can perform some light duty work. We're not going to hammer it with all the events right out the gate, and start to define the event inventory and capture those in a schema registry so that we're going to have that regardless of what tech we use. Like the concepts and the events, those are going to be persistent and valuable long term. So for this phase 1, we're looking at a few pieces of work. We want to harden Sidekick, so carve out the event store into its own queue, so that if it is overloaded, it's not going to impact our other background job processing. So I've been talking with the SREs. They know how to do this. They've already done that kind of sharding once. And they'll just need a single backend engineer on the product side to support some of those changes. But beyond that, we would be just looking to define and publish new events. So this would be me working with teams like on the create stage and in the CI CD stages to figure out what these key objects are, starting to define the schemas, starting to capture those, write them down, and work with devs, either as a direct borrow to me or as the individuals that work on the respective teams to actually implement those new events and raise them in the respective services. This aspect is still TBD.
So these events would there be existing events in the system, like, but are they implicit? Let's say like a project is being deleted, and then
Yeah.
we want to react to this, a lot of other things, or will be new events that we want to introduce to the system. It's like
Would probably
refactoring
be
to make it
the
explicit.
former. Yeah,
Okay.
where we're focusing on what the system already does and what it already communicates and making
Okay.
sure to capture those and define them. Maybe
Okay.
there's some use cases where, we're building out some new capability and we want to do it in an event-driven way. Cool, great. But the focus is more like retrospective on what we've already done to enable systems to respond to the behavior that we have today.
Okay.
So I want to pause here. So if we were to just do this, right? So we've got Sidekick hardened, we're still using the event store, we've just got more events streaming through it. Would that enable you to get started on CI events?
For CI, so I think completing this first phase, the way you described, it would unlock a lot of things for CI events. For example, we will already have like a list of events so that we can turn into CI events, or like there will be CI events supported. Say, for example, some issues related events or like push and things like that. That will solve a lot of this work that we will have to do at some point with CI events. I think there are some other things like outside of the event platform that will be blocking CI events. I'm just talking about the CI job token, security token. I think there's like a level of security and permissions, authorizations that needs to be happening with CI events.
And then auditing, I feel like we'll probably.
Yeah, there's auditing. There's a lot, like, if somebody closes an issue, but we want to build an automation to do something with issues.
And then we need to think about like
what do we run that automation with? Yes. So should that be an automation, like some service account that will always be able to perform these specific actions? Because there could be the side effects might not be allowed by the user triggering the event initially. Let's say if somebody closes an issue, but that doesn't have permission to create a pipeline, they will not be able to run, we will not be able to run the CI event. So there's all this kind of complexity we need to figure out. Yeah, especially with related to other complexity related to CI job token, impersonation,
Right.
things like that we need to figure out.
And then we kind of need to also think about like charging for storage related to CI events and what that looks like, the monetization side of this. Because this is going to be, if we look at anything like CI builds data, if people are going to be layering like data on top of that, we really need to think about the monetization of that, and then the strategy of retention related to that. And the reason why I jumped to monetization first is because if people are charged for it, they're going to want to maintain policies for it, right? They're going to want to enforce like a certain retention policy, or there's going to be like a behavior that's curtailing that, especially like on the self-managed front, right? Or on the GitLab.com front. Like today, if we run this as a service, that they're going to be going through GitLab.com. I'm not sure like how this event store is going to actually work in that regard. That's kind of a critical piece we'll need to kind of think about, that architecture and like how we're monetizing this for self-managed versus GitLab.com, because that is a challenge that we've had on the GitLab.com pipeline storage front. It's really, really expensive to store all this data for our customers, but now that they have access to 5 years of pipeline data, they don't want to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure like we're intentional about storing pipeline event data, CI event data upfront. And we need to just think about that in the design of this now. So that's probably blocking it before we instrument it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but another thing we could include as part of the phase one is as we identify, we create events, we can make sure that all our events have like some consistent schema, especially from auditability perspective. For example, there should be like who's the user triggering this event, and which project does this event is being triggered. At least for project level events, there might be some kind of a group level events possibly, but like most of them will be project level. So we want to be able to have auditing about this, logging and all this kind of stuff, but at least have a consistent schema. So if you want to roll out a new event, you might want to inherit from the basic schema, and then you add extra properties to it, for example. So that there's a lot of context already part of that event payload, let's say, making things easier, but at the same time consistent across multiple domains.
Right. So like leaning into the cloud events schema, for example.
For example, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. So certainly like we could capture that as kind of part of the organic defining events and publishing events, right? That's not necessarily new work. But you mentioned auditing and logging. Is that something that we should carve out as an explicit thing that you need support for on the event platform side?
Yes, I think it should be on your side. I also think monetization strategy should be on your side too, because if we're storing, like storage on your side should be on your side.
Yeah, that is something that we're looking at is, a lot of these systems have data retention policies, and we'll have to, the choices we make there hugely impact the total cost of things.
That's right.
So we are looking at that as well.
Total cost of ownership of an event storage is going to live on the platform side. It's not going to live on the individual systems integrating with the event store. So I do feel like it should live on the platform side.
Yeah, I agree with that
to tell
you
to do your job. That's not what I'm saying. So, sorry, Jeff. I didn't mean to sound like that.
No, not at all. Not at all. So certainly on the event side, I do think like you mentioned, specifically how it impacts CI storage and CI usage. That feels like it is still more on your side of the house, but everything up to that point we could be the owners of.
The way that I see this is like we would own the interface and experience of how people are setting policies, but we need to make sure that there's an interface or like a predictable way of like how that fits into whether or not we're even charging for that thing.
That makes sense.
Or whether or not like this is something that we're doing, or there's enforcement of those policies on your side.
that
Because
makes
if we're
sense.
choosing as a business that we're not going to do this, or we're not going to enforce policies for events, then like that kind of puts us in a tricky spot, because then we're going to be saturating these limits on the CI side, right? And
Absolutely.
as a CI business, we're telling you as a business requirement, we know that this is how our users behave. So we should find ways to restrict that behavior, because we know they're going to come in and say, we want this data forever, even if there's no requirement to have it for forever. And as
Yeah,
a business, that's very
that's good to know.
expensive for us to maintain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I am looking at all of this event store stuff being much more transient. Like it is
Yes.
not long-lived data, like maybe 24 hours retention, just long enough that as if a service explodes, it can catch up when it comes back. That's it.
Yeah.
But we do still need to document that and kind of understand the costs of even 24-hour retention. We'll make sure to include that in our first spec as well. What else? So you mentioned some other items like
Yeah,
security
so
on the CI job token side, but what about authorization?
yeah, regarding authorization, it's something we have to build on top of CI events. As I was saying, like
Okay.
we will want to have the ability to, first of all, figuring out which user will react to the CI event. That will create the
Right.
pipeline. Is it always going to be the triggerer of the event, or it's going to be some service account? And so there will be some authorization there, not only on, can this user run the pipeline, but also can have visibility into that event that was generated. Like, is an issue being closed, some kind of from a project where that user doesn't have permission,
Exactly.
the service account, or does it
Exactly.
have some comments that are like it should be hidden from that. So this is some of the consideration we need to take care of. So not only who can run the pipeline, but also can the user read the original event. Some sort
That's
of
a tricky problem in and of
permission
itself.
needs to be somehow bundled into the event itself.
Mhm.
So there has to be some way of saying, can I read this event? So the event needs to be somehow authorized through policies or things like that. Which,
That's a
if
clever
it's
idea.
an issue event, maybe can delegate to an issue policy or something like that. But I think
Yeah.
there should be a way of saying, can we authorize events
Yeah.
based on the current user? So
Yeah, that would definitely simplify, especially all of the checks that your downstream systems would have to immediately call back to GitLab to figure out like, okay, well, I just got this thing. Can I do anything with it?
yes,
Yeah.
and yeah, and this is probably a separate topic, but like for anything that remains in the monolith, we can do these checks, and probably we will have to do these
Yes.
checks. Maybe not for exactly everything, but in most of the cases, we will have to do these checks. So, for example, if a project is deleted and we want to have various domain react to deleting a project so that each domain can do a cleanup of their data, you probably don't need to have a user propagated to it, so you just
Right.
do the cleanup. Don't need to do any authorization there.
That makes sense.
The project is already deleted. But in some other cases, you want to have authorization checks. It gets more complicated when we want to have events sent to external systems.
Yes.
Then this external system need to react. We need to have initially probably the events we will allow to go outside will be events where we don't need to do authorizations, like logging or pipeline, data pipeline for usage and
Yeah.
analytics and stuff like that. But yeah, we have to figure out what is like a way of sending stuff
That's a great point.
outside.
That's a great point.
Um,
All right. Before I continue, I see we're past time. Do we need to wrap? Do y'all have other things to jump to?
I can stay a few minutes more.
I just let my person know that I would be a little late, but
Sorry
so
about
my
that.
next, no, don't worry. I mean, I am invested in this call and I want to be supportive. So I just wanted to let the person know that
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So I think we touched on all the things and kind of where ownership belongs. There's some aspects of authorization that belong to the event store. There's some aspects of monetization and cost management. probably auditing and logging as well. But suppose
Logging
we,
is logging is probably largely covered by
yeah.
Sidekick logs today, since
Hmm.
like I think we log when we publish an event, but
Hmm.
then the receival of events by subscribers is already logged through Sidekick. We didn't want
Yeah.
to invest any more on that because that was like clear enough. But we can definitely do some better logging and improvements there as we need to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree that we're not at 0 today, but I just want to double check that we have
Mhm.
everything that everybody needs to support the system. All right. So supposing we did all these things that we just covered, would this unblock you to get started on CI events, or at least unblock you enough to be able to answer those other questions that you need to start on CI events?
Yeah, this definitely is going to be like a huge improvement.
Okay.
Uh, I guess like from the point of view of CI events, it's more like we have big challenges in terms
Yeah.
of authorization and authorization primarily. Um, but yeah, like a lot of the things will be resolved by the work of your team.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, that is exactly what I needed to know. So I'm going to continue trying to move this forward. There are so many stakeholders involved in this. Some of this may take a while, but I'm hoping that we can get some kind of like folks that are just interested in helping out and participating on this, like folks in AutoFlow have started defining some events and piping them in. So maybe we can do some like, kind of under the table building this stuff out while we figure out how to get it officially funded. So
Yeah,
I'll
I
keep
think
you in the loop as we go, but
yeah, just one last point.
Mhm.
Based on my experience with the event store, it can be challenging from a culture perspective
Yeah,
to think in terms of event driven. So we have a lot of code where engineers just follow existing patterns. I'll say, I just, run a sidekick worker here and there, and then, it's going to work.
yep,
So all in merge request reviews, we end up saying, hey, this is a good idea actually to introduce an event, and it turns out to almost always be like a good idea.
hmm,
But I think I think the challenge there is like how do we get engineers to switch mindset and start thinking more in terms of events. You don't want to have your team catching up and trying to convert work like maybe existing events, but new
absolutely.
events we need to think in terms of new events from the get-go. So it can be challenging to see a requirement as, oh, this is actually an event that is happening in the system. Then I can create a side effect. So think more in terms of event and side effects. Kind of can help engineers to think more event driven. But it's very um, yeah, we are thinking from a different perspective today.
For sure. For sure.
So
And some of the bounded context work, I think, helps people start to see the lines a little
yes,
bit more, but it's
yes,
going to be an uphill battle. I agree.
yes, yeah.
Rails
So I
makes
think
it
we might need
really
to
easy to do
socialize this.
things in a synchronous way. So,
Yes, so we need to socialize this a little bit more, I think,
okay,
to get support from everyone.
perfect. 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 Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry for keeping you over,
No,
but I'll keep you updated as we move along.
thank you so much, team. This is
Thank
great.
you.
Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Bye.
Have a good afternoon, y'all.
Bye bye.